People who won/inherited a lot of money, what are your horror stories from people begging for your money? Story 1. I'm dealing with this stuff right now. My great-aunt and godmother was a lesbian. Her partner, my Auntie Kitty, had been with her since the 1950s. When my godmother moved to New York, Auntie Kitty was disowned by her family when it came out she was with a woman. My godmother died when I was 12 and left my Auntie Kitty everything in her will, which made things strained with my dad's family, though my dad and one of his brothers still talked to her. I moved to New York at 18 for school, and knowing no one else in the city, we became close. She was thrilled that I wanted to have a relationship with her and spend time with her, and didn't hesitate to think of her as my aunt, even though she technically wasn't. She was legit the greatest, and we spent holidays together, and she would come to things I worked on, and I knew all her friends, and she knew mine. I basically spent a decade with her, being like another grandmother to me. She died a few months ago, and it sucks. I miss her a lot, to put it lightly, but she was in her 90s and lived a long life. Thing was, she left everything to me. Now, I knew she had money, it was hard to miss, but I didn't know how much money she had. I ended up with a decent-sized amount of cash and investments, a brownstone in the city, and a place on the beach in the Carolinas. Her family came out of the woodwork when she passed away, sniffing around for money and demanding I give them the beach house, or cash, or whatever. Her will states explicitly that they're not to receive anything from her estate, and it's all to go to me. But they're threatening to sue since they're sure she wanted to give them something, even though she hadn't talked to any of them in over half a century, and in some cases had never met them. On the opposite side of things, my dad's sisters and brothers are ticked off they didn't get anything because they'd occasionally send her a Christmas card. None of them view it as fair that I was given everything when they were given nothing. None of them showed up to her funeral. None of them had properly seen or talked to her in years, except my dad. One of my aunts has gone so far as harassing my boyfriend since he's apparently only in it for the money, despite the fact that he had a better relationship with her than she did and had to help me plan her funeral. It's basically a poop show, and I hate it. Story 2. On throwaway, so I'm not outed. A few years ago, a family member was killed. My parents secretly sued the person and company responsible, and we were awarded millions in a settlement. To this day, I haven't shared this info with anyone because it's very personal. We don't want anyone to think we profited from their death, because that wasn't our intention. We wanted to make sure the spouse was cared for financially. After about 2 years of my parents being involved in court, the settlement was finalized. During the time, my sibling's spouse was cared for emotionally and financially by my family. After the case was settled, the spouse was awarded several million as one of the stipulations my parents set. Immediately after, they disappeared from our lives entirely. It was extremely disappointing to my family when that happened, especially considering all we had been doing to keep them going. Imagine having a son or daughter suddenly die and having to fight lawyers for years to give their spouse a happy life, only to have them take the money and run once it was all finished. Yes, my family did receive a rather large sum, and we had a dinner on his birthday to which this news was shared with all the siblings. It was a shock learning why the spouse had completely cut us off, and that I'd suddenly become rich as a result of everything. It feels wrong and slightly embarrassing, but I'm sure my sibling would be proud that they could help the family after their death. Still, I'll never tell anyone what happened because I don't want my sibling's life story tarnished any further. I think everyone in my family feels the same. Nothing has changed in our lives afterward. At first, I felt extremely guilty spending a dime of that money, but over time I've learned to appreciate the opportunities that it has given me. All of us have continued down the same path as before, although my parents have been traveling a lot, and I don't blame them one bit. Story 3. My mom and dad won big once at a casino around 25 years back, one of those once-in-a-lifetime medium-level jackpots, around $10,000. Most of the money went into bills and a few family fun things over the course of a summer. However, during that time, my aunt and a few of my mother's relatives kept bullying her for cash. Her relatives kept demanding she owed them some of the cash because the casino trip was with them. They invited my folks along and drove them. So by their logic, they were obliged to be part of the winnings. My aunt, on the other hand, just kept begging so she could help out with her kids' debts. They're very spoiled kids, and over the years have run themselves into the ground financially, and every time their mother, my aunt, digs them out. My folks never gave in, even though my mother's relatives threatened to sue, which they didn't, and my aunt eventually just moved on. After this, no one on my mother's side would go with my folks without making clear that if they won, they would get some of the money. Needless to say, my parents never went with them again, and for a time went on their own. I was young at the time and used to not having much growing up because we were very poor. This cash really did us a service, but the things that stand out to me the most are all the abusive calls my mother and father got about this money, and how I found out later on that these people beyond my aunt all made near six-figure incomes. They didn't need the money, they just wanted it. Story 4. I won around 5,000 pounds on a soccer accumulator a few years ago. Not a lot really, but a lot for a 23-year-old. To cut a long story short, because I didn't pay off my father's credit card debt with it, he fell out with me and pretty much tried to ruin my life. He told my then partner I had a gambling problem. I didn't, unless spending £5 a week on football constitutes a problem. Got my mother to call my work to tell them I had a problem, which resulted in work getting a freaking counselor in to talk to me, and basically preyed on my family's love for me by making them all make me feel horrendously guilty for ever placing a bet in the first place. It all reached a head when I came home to my partner in tears, and my mother and father sat comforting her on the sofa, proceeding to tell me if she didn't know if she could trust me, and why couldn't I just admit how long I'd been gambling for. I physically removed my father from my house that night and told him to never darken my doorstep again. All over $5,000. Parents are sometimes toxic and an awful influence on your life. I cut him out because of it, which sadly has meant my relationship with my mother has taken a hit. But it was honestly the best thing I ever did. Don't be afraid of doing so if they add nothing but negativity to your life. Story 5. I won a lawsuit settlement after almost dying in a fire. I was under 18 at the time of the incident, but was 18 when it finally settled. My mother told me unless I gave her half of my settlement, I would have to find a new place to live. I was in my senior year of high school when this happened. She said she deserved it because she was the only one in my life who was always there for me. I didn't give her the money. She kicked me out and tried to keep some of my personal belongings. Not like I had much, since everything was lost in the fire. We didn't talk for months, until she randomly showed up at my house one day. She asked me for rent money and gave me some BS sob story. I wrote her a check for $5,000, hoping it'd make her go away. It did for a time. She and I barely spoke, until years later when I was pregnant. A few years ago, I was in a bad car accident, hit by an 18-wheeler, and got some money. I told no one, especially my mom. She has insisted numerous times I was entitled to a settlement for it and should speak to a lawyer she found. She took it upon herself to talk to lawyers on my behalf, or tried to. I just ignored her for months until she finally gave it up. Story 6. I was lucky enough to have very successful grandparents. I'm also lucky enough to still have all of my grandparents at the age of 31. They're all over 82. The grandfather of importance to this conversation only has an 8th grade education, but he built a strong business, water well drilling. When each of his 7 grandchildren were born, he deposited $87,000 the year I was born. I assume that's the same for the others, into a managed trust. We don't make a habit of discussing money, but there are a few requirements. Namely, I won't have complete control over it until I'm 50, I get a statement every fall, and I know my retirement is taken care of. What happened when I told my spouse? We dated for 3 years, been together 8, and it was close to 3 years before I even mentioned it. Aside from my spouse, it's no one's business. Why on earth would I tell people of my impending windfall? Be smart, people. Keep your bank accounts out of conversation. Story 7. I inherited a fair amount of money when my grandfather passed away. My husband and I were planning on using it to purchase our first house. We had been saving, but clearly could have a much lower mortgage with this windfall. Well, my husband works a side business where he builds custom vehicles. One friend who was running out of money, and his car was only about halfway done, found out about the inheritance, only because we stupidly asked his advice on mortgage options, and decided he was going to pull his car because he didn't have the funds to finish it, and then sue us for $10,000. And unfortunately, we got a lawyer and ended up spending over $3,500 to have him say that the customer usually is right and we'd be further ahead to just settle and pay him, because the lawyer fees would be much more if we continued to fight. Breaks my heart to this day that a good chunk of my inheritance went to pay that dong bag off so he could take his vehicle somewhere else to get it finished. Story 8. My grandmother has dementia and her husband is dying of cancer. They have over $1 million in assets that have been divided between 4 sons. One son is mentally ill, a junkie who has been in and out of jail. He's already been promised their house as his share of inheritance, but he's been doing all he can to get more from his mother while her husband has been in the hospital, slowly dying the last few months. He steals her credit cards, opens new ones in her name, and attempts to access their money through online banking. My step-grandfather is trying to get her declared mentally incompetent to prevent my uncle from manipulating her finances, but between his health issues and being in and out of the hospital, it's proving difficult. When her husband dies, which will unfortunately be soon, he plans on moving into their house, which he already sees as his, and most likely milking my grandmother dry. The sad part is she has dementia and has no idea what is going on. Story 9. I am fortunate that my father's family is well off. Everything has been locked into trust funds since my grandparents' death. Now my father has died, I have control over my father's share. My uncle, who is a weed-dealing, smoking in and out of jail, never held a job, dropkick son of a loving woman who always gave him hand, and brother to my father, who tried to help him support him, even though he was sick for many years. Anyways, I've withdrawn my share because that family sucks at financial management, and I have reinvested it in my own trust. My uncle has started calling me monthly from jail, asking for help with lawyers, or to pay for something. He still has living brothers, but he thinks a girl 3 times younger than him should be supporting him because he can't get a job and I'm family. I feel nothing for the man who has thrown his life away and leeched off my father in his last years. I'm glad, though, better than him harassing my mom. Story 10. Even more pathetic because it was so little money, Grandma lived off her pension after selling her house way cheap to Aunt. After she died, other Aunt divided up her money and stuff. I think each grandkid got $1,000, one piece of her inexpensive furniture, a few little things, none of it worth any money. But Cousin Kay, whose parents got a super cheap house that she keeps saying she wants, carried on about how she was promised everything. She wanted the 10-year-old freezer her sister with little kids got. She wanted the dishes. She wanted. 10 years later, I avoid talking to her because I'm sure I'll still hear about all of Grandma's valuables that other aunt threw away. I think the rest of us should have just gone in together, said, take one thing, then someone else's turn, and we all would have left after round 2 and left the rest for Cousin Kay to take everything else and saved ourselves a lot of accusations. Story 11. My dad has 2 sisters. One of them was an out-of-control mess that, after stealing and making her parents' life hell, they finally had to cut her out of their lives. My grandma died, and she didn't even bother coming to the funeral. My grandpa ended up in a memory care facility, which blew through the last of what they had saved up, and then my dad and his other sister took over the payments. When he passed away, they had paid over $70,000 combined for him to live in a nice facility for the last years of his life. After he died, the mess of a sister suddenly showed up demanding her share of the inheritance, assuming that it would be a large sum of money. They sent her a bill for 1/3 of the $70K. Story 12. I actually didn't inherit anything at all because my mom died broke and in debt. But I have a few grand in donations for a spot at her cemetery. Still haven't decided what spot we want. My sister found out and keeps asking me for money from the donation fund. I sent her $100 just because I know she lives in the middle of butt-frick nowhere. Then she keeps asking for $40 here and there. When I tell her no, she later posts a photo of her smoking weed. Yes, I'm sure you really needed that money for groceries. It's quite pathetic. She doesn't even realize how expensive the cemetery spot is. We don't even have enough to cover a decent spot at all. Story 13. My grandpa was pretty well off, and he suddenly died of undiagnosed prostate cancer a decade or so ago. The kids from his second marriage immediately swooped in and started claiming everything as theirs, despite us being just as close to him as they were. It ended with a lawsuit and the family being split in half, with us not regarding them as family anymore. We ended up getting basically nothing, and I'm frankly not impressed with how it was handled by either side. It's really sad seeing people you've known your whole life acting like that and ruining decades of being family in a couple of weeks. Story 14. When my grandmother died, she left money to pay for my entire college education, including graduate school. At the time, it seemed that all my friends needed money. So, to be true to my grandmother's wishes, I said nothing about the inheritance and paid for those college years as she intended. If I'd done otherwise, they would have begged me for money for a variety of needs. Story 15. I had most of my college paid for through scholarships and a fund my parents set up when I was a baby. My roommate junior year would always bring this up as an excuse to not pay for things. Example, well, you have a college fund, so you should pay for my dinner too. I have to take out loans, so you should pay for my rent this month. I ended up moving out and avoided her the rest of my time at school. Story 16. Family comes out of the woodwork threatening to sue for the money. Family had surprise visits and looked like they thought I hid the money in the house somewhere. No amount of telling them we inherited less than $500 would make them go away. They did not believe it. Now they all just hate us, and I no longer get invited to family outings. Story 17. My grandmother had an education fund made for me and put money in it every month. I was pretty young, and my mom was poor and wanted to use that money to buy pot and cigarettes and other stuff. She kept bugging me and bribing me with stuff. I told my grandmother, who made sure my mom couldn't access the account. Click on one of the videos you see on the screen now, or a Karen will sue you.